Well, thank you very much for these comments. I was also, as I was listening to you, Nick, I was wondering when you talked about technology, whether the fact that so much of technological research today is actually done in the countries of the so-called South, like China, for example, whether that couldn't generate more, for example, labor-intensive technology that could help integrate greater numbers of people in the labor force or generate new products that could insert a new dynamism. And so there may be other sources that we're not seeing of changes in the global economy that may bring in these more positive forces. Having seen that Stefan Dierkon came in very modestly through the side, I was wondering if you would like to make some additional comments to the excellent ones we've had at this point or later? In a moment, okay. So now I think we will have no problem in getting questions to these interesting presentations. This lady will facilitate the microphone. So if we take, yes, please, three here in the front.
Thank you very much.
If you can also please introduce yourselves.
Does this work?
It is on.
And we will also have people, you can write questions and we will get them here. So there are no questions here, but we have 100 people listening in who wanted to come, but there was no space. So if you want to add your questions, please, Nick.
Thank you very much. My name is Tim Lancaster. Fascinating contributions from all three. Thank you so much. My question is, whatever happened to savings and investment? You didn't mention, none of you mentioned this. Arthur Lewis taught us that this was important. Chenery did. And the experience of East Asia and the Soviet Union was very high savings and investment ratios. Perhaps you could comment, Dani, first.
Thank you, Tim. Jeff?
Thanks.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm going to. Duncan Green from Oxfam. Brilliant. Thanks to all three of you, all four of you. Quick question and then longer, something more substantial. So one is, could you spell out what escalator services look like? Yeah, some examples. I couldn't quite get my head around that. And more substantially, is there a link here with the inequality question? Rising inequality, is what you described also a motor of rising inequality within countries?
Sorry, the gentleman behind him.
John Burton from KPMG. You presented Asia as basically an exception in your data, but it's a pretty big exception given that it's 2/3 of the world's population. And I just wondered if you could concoct a storyline whereby changes in Asia due to demography and rising incomes will mean that Asia eventually has to move out of the manufacturing sector and leave it essentially to Africa to step in where Asia took off. And secondly, okay, we might lose unskilled labour opportunities, but can't we solve that problem by investments in skills and education so that there is more opportunity for Africans, both in manufacturing, but also with technological integration? You could have more trade in services than we currently have.
And last, Teddy Brett, and then if that's okay, we ask for the first round of replies.
I mean, if I could just add a dimension of pessimism to the discussion. I thought Dani's gave us a superb presentation. For me, it was very much back to the future. We're actually talking about the infant industry problem here. We're actually back with List and the problem of open, underdeveloped countries competing with already developed countries. And what I didn't get in the presentation was the way in which being integrated into an open global economic system impacts upon tendencies to inequality or towards equality. If we go back to an earlier point you made, all of the successful industrialization strategies, including China to this day, depended upon interventionist policies to offset the de-equilibrating effects of open competition globally between underdeveloped and developed countries. So the critical problem we've had is that over the last 30 years, we've taken away the possibility of introducing those policies, and the effect has been a massive expansion in inequality and therefore in crisis, as Piketty and so on produce. And of course, that inequality intensifies at the level that we now have strong surplus countries, China, Germany, that are accumulating surpluses, leaving underdeveloped countries in deficit, who are therefore having to cut government services. Take a look at what's happening to Greece. So that we've actually got a massively disequilibrating process going on because of market opportunities, and therefore it seems to me that industrial policy is that sounds like a rather soft version of something that we need, which must be much stronger in the direction of redistribution from strong countries, strong sectors, strong clusters to weak ones.
Thank you. Okay, so you have a couple of small questions to deal with. And if at any point either Dirk or Nick or Stefan want to... No? Not at this stage. So it's all yours, these easy questions.
Well, let me first thank my discussants, Dirk and Nick. I think they were very, very, very useful, and I'm actually looking for any excuse and reason to be optimistic here, and so I would very much like to be proved wrong on this. In a way, my pessimism is on these issues is a reaction to what I thought was an undue optimism until about 2 or 3 years ago about the growth prospects of low-income and emerging market economies. And in many ways, I think that we sort of, the conventional wisdom has turned perhaps, has overshot and has become, a little bit too much, too negative. And since I hate to be in line with conventional wisdom, so I think that might be another non-economic reason for me to become more optimistic. But I take all the points. I think the issue of rebasing and more than rebasing, what that has implied for the structure of economies and the size of the manufacturing sector. I think that's important. We haven't sort of done a systematic analysis of that. So I take all the points that they made. But I think we are, sort of disagreeing with the, size of the second derivative rather than the first derivative. I mean, I don't think that I take these points to say sort of that, it's not as bad as you think, as opposed to, Africa in a fundamental sense can replicate something like the East Asian a miracle, which effectively, continuing growth on the, sort of the Tanzanian and Ethiopian rates. I mean, that's sort of what it would entail if you think that that's sort of sustainable. But I take from your comments that you don't actually think that's sustainable either, and maybe we're thinking about whether the sustainable growth rate is 3% as opposed to 3.5%. Maybe I may be imposing my own framework on you, but my sense is that the kinds of issues you've raised are things that would sort of move the growth rate to 0.5 percentage point, or maybe rather than. But again, I think we'll know a lot more as more data comes in, and whether we'll be in a position to talk about other things than, the one, Chinese investment in shoes in Ethiopia, that sort of is the example of successful industrialization. Just briefly on the other things, why don't we talk about saving and investment? I guess it sort of has gone out of fashion because we don't think that's sort of where the constraints are in many ways. And if you want to relate it to Arthur Lewis, remember that Arthur Lewis, the transition in investment or saving investment was we wanted to go from about 5% saving investing country to about a 10% saving investing country. Nobody is there. I mean, basically every country is more or less double that.
China's
but I mean, right. I think in most of the countries that I know, actually the constraints are much more on the desire to invest, on the investment demand side rather than the investment supply side. It is not the shortage of investable funds that's constraining private investment. That it is the willingness to invest. Duncan Green asked, what are the escalator services? I don't know. I'm asking. I hope there are some. Rising inequality implications, absolutely. So that's one of the implications of the story is that effectively manufacturing, including manufacturing that's sort of plugged into global value chains, becomes more like an enclave, a high-wage enclave in the economy in a way that the extractive parts of extractive sectors typically have been. So it has the same kind of implications for inequality. Incidentally, the effect of global value chains and sort of the slicing of the value chain and the componentization. The effect of that on the measurement of the size of the manufacturing is actually not that clear, because there are two things that are happening. One is that many manufacturing services actually have outsourced those services, so that tends to create the statistical illusion that manufacturing has the size has come down, which is the point that Nick made. But there's actually the fact that manufacturing services are actually on balance doing a lot more services in-house as well. So they're keeping the after-sale services, design, R&D, and all of that is being done in-house. So in fact, the only study that I've seen that explicitly accounts for the services that are done in manufacturing shows that actually the services component in manufacturing as measured as manufacturing has actually increased because of so if that is true, if anything, the bias goes in the opposite direction, that we're actually exaggerating the size of actual manufacturing because of the increasing share of what was actually services within manufacturing production. But that's sort of a footnote. Is it possible for Africa to take China's place? I think it's just going to be the timing just doesn't work. I mean, I think it's quite likely that China over the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to lose some manufacturing. But I mean, I just given the head start, and I just don't think that there is. I may be wrong on that. I mean, I think I think we would have seen a lot more of that economic substitution taking place in the last 10, 15 years when the world economy was buoyant before the financial crisis, when many of these trends were already evident in China, and that we haven't seen it. I'm not sure if we will when in a phase where the world economy is not expanding as rapidly in the next 10, 15 years. Shouldn't we not worry about loss of low-skilled jobs by investing in skills? You have, that doesn't help you now. I mean, I think my colleague and friend Ricardo Hausmann likes to say that, you have to create jobs for the people you have, not the people you wish you had. And so, right now you have, sort of low-skilled people, and you have to create jobs for them. Of course, you have to invest in skills, but that's going to be the solution for a problem of 20 years from now, not today. Finally, the question about sort of infant industry and sort of how open markets and globalization has affected the possibilities of industrialization. I think that's really it's real. I mean, we see it. I mean, an economy like Ethiopia today is importing all kinds of stuff that in the old times it would be making itself. I mean, is importing cardboard boxes for the export of cut flowers or very simple furniture, stuff that it would have been normally sort of import substituting as a regular part of the development process. And now it's not happening because it's sort of open to imports from China. So we live in a very, very different world economy because of the decline in tariffs and transport costs. So the natural possibilities of import substitution have basically gone out. I think that's a big part of why these countries are not, I don't think, going to industrialize nearly as much. And I should have stressed this, and I think it's a good reminder, that a lot of it is not just that export opportunities are not going to be there, but it's also that the import substitution opportunities, the things that for producing stuff for the home market, for the domestic consumption, that is not nearly as much, because when you can import all that stuff cheaply from Asia, you don't have the room for that. Now, then it becomes a very difficult question. Should we go back and have, sort of high tariffs, import protection? I mean, it's, but without question, without, sort of necessarily, making that, reaching that particular policy conclusion, I think it's quite clear that the fact that we live in a much more globalized product market today has made countries that did not have an initial comparative advantage in manufacturing that much harder, or to put it differently, that it put the emphasis on adequate industrial policies, which many of these countries could not really pursue for administrative and other reasons, made that challenge all that much more demanding. Let me just...
Well, thank you very much, Dani. I found your last point extremely convincing, unfortunately. But I mean, that having such an open economy and having China as such an efficient, low-cost producer makes it much more difficult than in the past to pursue such policies. If I may, just before I ask other people to ask questions, can I maybe just ask one question? Is do you not think that, for example, in this potential green revolution that we talk so much about, renewable energy, but also change of development model to be more consistent with the needs of climate mitigation, that there may be some new opportunities that we don't even know about today, and that could offer possibilities even of leapfrogging for developing countries. And I think that may be perhaps a sort of optimistic note in the medium term. But I don't want to monopolize the discussion, and we have a lot of questions. Stefan.
Thank you for being in the corner. I thought I could discreetly walk in a bit late. But I just want to add so that, it's just brilliant what Dani is telling us. And of course, as coming from DFID, you have to be optimistic. You can't be in this business without having huge optimism bias. But it's actually, I would say, it's good for the world that Dani is a little bit pessimistic and a bit more realistic, I think, these days. Just coming back from a trip to Zimbabwe and Malawi and getting like the vice president in Malawi saying, oh, we're going to industrialize in the next 5 years, that is actually quite helpful. And indeed, a lot of the noises in the policy debates we're getting in African context are being very, very unrealistic. I know I'm going to get in trouble, but if I say like the United Nations Commission for Africa and so on, the kind of superficial, quick and dirty things, as if it's all going to quickly happen, it's actually quite important to keep a bit of the economics in it and a bit of caution there. But of course, I always totally agree with Nick whenever he says something. But Nick made one point, and I do want to actually see, Dani, whether you could comment on that. I also would have a sense that the industrialization we saw in Africa coming out of the 1970s was different. It was not comparable to industrialization waves. It's a little bit also that we've had industrialization waves in India that actually petered out, and that actually in the 90s things started changing again. So are we looking really at the data and saying, we are looking at, oh, well, it was there, but it's all gone down. But actually it just never was there. The industrial capabilities were never there in some of these countries. Ghana, Nigeria are just very bad example. And then the final question or point is that you ended your presentation is something I seem to agree with when I go around and look at the different African countries, what's going on, which is a point of it's likely going to be more heterogeneity. And I don't think you mean it because of extractives or not, but actually heterogeneities in these kind of countries. And I would be quite interested in knowing what would drive heterogeneity and are there any things that one could get. So my own impression is, and I think Dirk Willem's data suggested already, and we see it in the data, it's actually there's much more diversity in Africa than there was 20, 25 years ago. Some countries doing certain things. And so maybe if you could reflect, what can drive some of these heterogeneous patterns, or is it also maybe just wishful thinking and optimism bias?
You want to take that? Okay. Well, thank you. Dani would like to reply now, and then we'll have a few questions.
Yeah, just very briefly, thanks, Stefan. On the whether the apparent peak of this 1970s may have been illusory, it's always possible, but I've never seen a case. I've looked across countries. Actually, I never see a double hump. You see. You see cases where, just 2 or 3 years, very short periods of decline that might be then overcome because of crises, other things. But I don't recall ever seeing a real sort of a double hump, and this would require double hump. Even China. Most people don't know that, but in fact, China had many more people as a share of its total labor force in manufacturing before its economic reforms than afterwards. It never, it never actually recovered. So even in the case where, you opens up and becomes an export-oriented superpower, employment still is actually below what it had been before. Of course, it's a very different case, but economically, there is no reason why there should not be a double hump and you sort of recover. But I just have it would have never doesn't seem to be in the data. On the second issue was heterogeneity. I'll give a very glib answer, but I think a lot will depend here on sort of the nature of the political regime, and in particular and how the state and the government is able to sort of interact with the private sector and create the kind of collaboration and alliances that requires really that enables the state to have the kind of agility to respond to the needs of the moment. And I think that's a quality of governance that's very difficult to quantify, but you sort of see it and you know it when you're there, and you can see. I attribute a lot of the change in the underlying growth regime in Ethiopia to the fact that you went from where the government essentially thought that you would never talk to business because they were only rent seekers, the only time they wanted to come and talk to you, to actually a government that's actually saying, well, maybe we should listen to them, occasionally would actually help them, and occasionally help them and remove them some bottlenecks. And you get the cut flowers going, you got other things going, and now sort of the whole sort of nature of the dialogue in large parts have changed. That's of course the easy part early on. Then you need to institutionalize that. It needs to go beyond the very top and just the prime minister and so forth. And I think that heterogeneity will depend a lot on sort of whether these patterns of pragmatic, experimental, embedded policymaking processes are institutionalized, or to what extent they remain highly authoritarian and detached kind of policymaking regimes. Again, it's a glib answer, but that would be my guess.
Very good. So we have lots of questions. Is there anybody here from a low-income country? Actually, maybe they could ask a question. No. Okay. So they're back in the back. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Mark Boland. I work as an Africa economist at Bloomberg.
Can you be very brief?
Yeah. So my question was on automation. I mean, you've definitely seen this in electronics and car autos manufacturing, but hasn't really spread to textiles manufacturing yet. Do you think this will happen? And I mean, textiles manufacturing is often the first entry into manufacturing for low-income countries. And if, say, there would be a high degree of automation, would that, pull up the rung getting into industrialization or industrializing?
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman here, the gentleman.
Thanks. Could you say a bit about the role of agriculture? Because we've talked a lot about manufacturing, about services of various kinds. Agriculture was kind of passed over in most of what's been said. Just to amplify that very slightly but quickly, productivity growth would be possible in agriculture with new technology if the things like the extension services were recreated. They've largely disappeared, I understand.
Thank you.
So it's a question of whether that could be a role for unconventional policies.
Thank you very much. And there in the back? Right in the back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could you say a few words about economic transformation from the informal to the formal sector, and how we could make that happen more? It seems that there's a hurdle, and people seem to be avoiding the hurdle.
Okay, well, thank you very much for such good questions. There's a question here from outside the room. Should overseas development assistance focus more on fundamentals such as health and education to at least improve the quality of slow growth? So you have 4 very good questions and no time to answer.
There are 4 good questions, and I think a thoughtful response would maybe take not just the time, but also the thinking that I haven't done. Maybe just working backwards and very quickly, should overseas, I think I think overseas development should focus what well-governed countries think they need. So then it's very difficult to make a generalization. Informal to formal transitions, it's a huge, big area. We just, I think we just don't know. There are clearly important barriers and wedges. The fact that that's such a common feature across the whole developing world suggests that there are some very common, basic, different obstacles. My view is that it's mostly driven not by economic regulations or taxes or the cost of formality, but just that there are fundamental economic reasons that keep the size of the formal sector low. Formal sector firms simply do not seem to have the incentive to want to invest and grow and expand, whether it is for problems of appropriability, for problems that they perceive low returns, for a whole range of reasons, and then the informal sector becomes essentially the absorbing sector. Absorbs the growing employment. But we need more research to understand really that much better. Role of agriculture, absolutely. It's a huge absorber of employment. And it's actually the case that productivity growth in agriculture over the last decade or two in many countries has been higher than productivity growth in manufacturing, although the differential is still to the benefit of manufacturing. What has happened though in agriculture is that again, sort of many of the improvements have come from sort of commercial farming and agro-business opportunities that tend to be not necessarily very much employment generating. And I think there again, you're sort of you have this thing: where will the jobs go? So you just want to identify sectors in these countries that are simultaneously high productivity or where productivity is growing, and they can absorb employment. They also are going to be increasing employment. And we just don't seem to have many of those things. And therefore, you inevitably, even when you have this success in agro-industry or certain segments of manufacturing or tradable services, you're just exacerbating this dualism of the economy, the formal informality split, or the inequality problem that Duncan was talking about earlier. Automation and skills. I think it's clearly some sectors it's a little bit less. Garments and footwear maybe not as much. But I'm really struck. But even there in Africa, in this famous shoe factory that we're talking about in Ethiopia, I heard the lady who actually the Chinese lady who runs this and sort of described the difference between investment in China back then, several decades ago, and now in Ethiopia in the following terms. And she said, when we were hiring, we were just basically hiring workers off the farm in China when we started to producing shoes. The only thing that we were looking for was whether they could do this. So very basic, eye-hand coordination was the only job requirement, and if they could do this, then they were fully qualified to work. Now, who is this same factory hiring in Ethiopia? Is skilled workers. Basically, a bunch of university workers who are just being hired. That's not necessarily because the nature of the work is much more skilled. Although I think the nature of technology has changed. It's also the fact that the whole sort of the balance between the supply of such opportunities and the demand for such jobs is so different in these countries than it is typically in China. So you're getting a very, very different mix of the labor force.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I was just wondering if Nick, Dirk, and yourself, Dani, want to have 1 minute each to have one big idea or comment or small comment.
I'll yield my time until I have 2 big ideas. I don't have one big idea. I really came here to listen to Dani. But I'm still worried about this non-linear group of countries left behind. And I think they probably exhibit different dynamics to what you're observing in your regressions. I think there is going to be non-laminar flow in the hydraulic term in how they achieve the fundamentals. And as a corollary of that, I worry that you're not addressing the political economy traps around mineral countries. That seems to be a persistent and stubborn equilibrium. That the people that are gaining the rents are able to keep the system pretty much as it is. It's held in place through inequality and through some pretty unsavory deals with the rest of the world. So that's my main worry, that these group of countries are so small that they exhibit particular dynamics and they're non-linear, and I urge you to think about that.
Thank you very much. Dirk?
Yeah, well, I've got two small ideas. I suppose one is that so African countries are not deindustrializing; they are industrializing at the moment. I think so. The trend is up rather than down, and it's doing it faster than we thought, but it's still at a very low level. And I think the constraint isn't necessarily that it hits the curve at this stage, but the constraint is more the political economy issues about making sure that you build industry for the future, although there, of course, there's the comparative advantage story. And the second small idea is about services. I think we got to be thinking not just about the direct jobs it creates, but also about the indirect jobs it creates. And I think, there's somebody from the CDC who's been thinking about investing in different sectors and what sort of ex-ante assessment tools you can use. And thinking about the services sector, they create, they're the backbone of an economy. They can create productivity in other sectors, in firms in other sectors, and that can then create indirectly a lot of jobs. So I think it's also thinking that through how it fits within the value chain is going to be very important, and we've got to be thinking about that more into the future. But otherwise, I really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, Dani. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank Dani in particular, but the 2 excellent commentators as well, for a really, really illuminating seminar. I personally have learned a lot, and I'm sure people in the audience have as well. I think it's been fantastic, and thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.